Introduction. In both life and death, the actress Maria Gavrilovna Savina defined an era of Russian life. A fixture of St. Petersburg's Imperial Alexandrinsky Theater for 4 decades, she was among the most visible celebrities of her era and was, in Catherine Schuller's assessment, quote, the most powerful actress of the Silver Age. A preeminent celebrity and a favorite of middle-class female audiences in the 1880s and 1890s, she remained a star fixture of the stage and a reliable subject of celebrity gossip in the popular press up until her death. Furthermore, as one of the founders and most involved members of the Russian Theatrical Society, Российское театральное общество, Savina was a leading figure in late Imperial Russia's emerging civil society, serving as a key leader and figurehead for the empire's leading professional theater organization. Her fame and status was made abundantly clear following her death in Petrograd on September 8, 1915. Her unexpected passing at the age of 61 after a brief illness registered as a major event, prompting eulogies and tributes in hundreds of newspapers from all corners of the empire, as well as requiems and public commemorative events in numerous locations throughout Russia. In an era in which high-profile funerals served as major public events and important social texts, Savina's death and funeral ranked among the most prominent in late Imperial Russia. The level of public interest and the ways in which her death was commemorated were striking, given the larger context of growing instability and privation gripping the Russian Empire amid the First World War. The state of Russia in the fall of 1915 and the larger discourse surrounding the war in public life played a key role in how Savina's death was reported and interpreted. Her passing came upon the heels of major military setbacks in the spring that resulted in Russia's so-called Great Retreat and prompted a political crisis in the summer as Nicholas II dismissed ministers and a progressive bloc formed in the Duma to demand major changes in the conduct of the war. The summer of 1915 prompted a, quote, crisis of authority as civic and political groups clamored for a role in managing the war effort. Despite facing wartime censorship, the press gave growing voice to these concerns. A sense of alarm and pessimism, coupled with demands for public action, was increasingly prevalent in Russian society by the end of the summer of 1915, as the war effort monopolized attention in public life and the press. To defenders of the actress, this wartime context provided an opportunity to reimagine Savina as a figure of patriotic respectability and demonstrated the ways in which the discourses surrounding the deaths of celebrity women performers could be adapted to new contexts and remained socially resonant even in the final crisis-stricken years of the Russian Empire. A cumulative portrait of Savina as a great artist, the embodiment of Russian womanhood, a devout Orthodox Christian, and a humble civic activist emerged from the avalanche of posthumous coverage. In a sense, it is striking how little these depictions corresponded to Savina's image throughout much of her career. Dismissed by the avant-garde as a reactionary force creatively and accused by critics of stagnating the repertoire of the imperial theaters with vapid and middle-brow fare, the thrice-married, childless actress with a well-known reputation for backstage machinations was not an obvious candidate to be a feminine symbol of Russian nationality. Yet in death, she appeared as a cultural institution and national icon for an empire at war, and the press coverage produced. The values of piety, sacrifice, and patriotism that were repeatedly ascribed to Savina allowed commentators and mourners to portray reactions to her death as evidence of a bourgeois public sphere that promised stability amid the upheavals of war. In posthumous coverage, she was repeatedly ascribed the restrained, respectable traits that were the characteristic values of the middle classes who made up the actress's most dedicated public. Long disparaged by the intelligentsia for their supposed vulgarity and denied influence over political and economic policy by the autocracy, the commercial classes found themselves suddenly ascendant with the outbreak of war as the empire turned to industrialists to help manage mobilization, and business leaders sensed an opportunity to position themselves as leaders of a national cause. This quest for stability through traditional respectability was refracted through a highly gendered wartime public culture in which rigid binary portrayals of masculinity and femininity predominated. The male soldier and the female nurse emerged as archetypes of how society was to participate in the conflict in propaganda, press coverage, and popular entertainment. These gendered visions of public life shaped reactions to Savina's death. But just as these cultural depictions masked a far more fluid reality in which the war created new roles and opportunities for both men and women, blurring distinctions between their experiences in many cases, Savina's treatment as a paragon of traditional femininity was not simply a triumph of patriarchal values, but reflected her thoroughly modern capacity for self-invention. This transformation of Savina into a figure of patriotic respectability was the product of many forces, including the periodical press, the larger rhetoric of wartime patriotism, and not least of all, the continuation of the careful actions that Savina herself had used throughout her life to manage and adapt her public image. The interplay of all of these forces was reflected in the publications of The Death of Maria Savina, Кончина Марии Gavrilovны Saviny, an elaborate 2-volume work prepared by her husband, the theater activist and merchant Anatoly Evgrafovich Molchanov, which examined virtually every facet of Savina's death and posthumous commemoration in the press in exhaustive detail. Through this memorial work and the press coverage that supported it, death became a means for transforming Savina from a celebrity actress, best known in many cases for melodramatic roles, into a symbol of idealized femininity and Russian nationality. And by examining the composition and content of these volumes, we can gain insights into the ways in which middle-class civil society, the press, and celebrity culture interacted to create and legitimize cultural status against the backdrop of an empire at war. The story of the death of Maria Savina is inseparable from the actress's extensive posthumous coverage in Russia's mass circulation press, the content of which served as the key source material for the 2 volumes. In a media context in which coverage of the war dominated the content of most publications, writers were quick to situate Savina's death within the dynamics of the conflict. Journalists marveled that her death attracted, quote, universal attention at a, quote, moment of the greatest trials of the country's state and civic life, end quote, and suggested its mystical connection to the war through the, quote, metaphysics of grief. A poem by L.G. Pechorin in the Ekaterinoslav newspaper Pridnepersky Krai declared that even though the war had, quote, nearly dulled our senses, it was not in our power to restrain tears over the actress. Pechorin looked forward to a time when, quote, this bloody chaos will pass and time will heal all wounds and a renewed Russia will commemorate you, our idol, end quote. The critic Yuri Belyayev drew a comparison between the impression made by the actress's death and the destruction of the cathedral of Reims by German forces. The periodical Rampa и Жизнь plotted Savina's life on a timeline of Russian military woes when it somberly noted that she was born during the Crimean War and died during, quote, the terrible days of the present European war, end quote. Even in material that did not explicitly reference the conflict, comparisons of Savina's death with the war were literally unavoidable. Given the enormous amount of war-related coverage in the press, any treatment of her death was likely to be surrounded by other accounts of the conflict. For instance, the September 19th issue of the popular journal Neva was exclusively dedicated to articles about the war, with the exception of a large photograph of Savina announcing her death. Similarly, the September 20th illustrated supplement for Yuzhny Krai only featured images related to the war, with the exception of a full page of photographs of Savina from throughout her career. Indeed, all of the major Russian illustrated journals covered Savina's death, often with extensive pictures of the actress, alongside their considerable war reporting. The journalist Nikolai Shibuev was one of many commentators who rushed to portray Savina against the backdrop of war as a figure of national significance and an embodiment of ideal femininity. He offered a particularly all-encompassing statement of the actress's significance. Quote, the present war is unanimously called a national Отечественная война. The death of Savina is a national death.
Семинар по театру.
She was, quote, everything for the Russian theater, he declared, adding, quote, Savina was the consummate actress, vaudeville, comedy, drama, tragedy, and everything she was great, because she was the consummate woman, женщина, end quote. In the voluminous coverage that accompanied Savina's death, she was repeatedly portrayed as a jewel of Russian culture and an exemplar of Russian womanhood. She was, the press insisted, a devout Orthodox Christian and a civic leader revered by poor actors throughout the empire as a maternal figure. Her death, some insinuated, may have been hastened by the strain of her philanthropic efforts to care for wounded soldiers, making her a casualty of the conflict and by extension a martyr. In doing so, commentators repeatedly situated Savina in what historian Melissa Stockdale has termed the rhetoric of sacred union. This First World War discourse, promoted by the state and reinforced by the Orthodox Church, the press, and civic organizations, portrayed Russia as internally united against a common foe and dedicated to the principles of, quote, faith, Tsar, and fatherland. Amid the war, appeals to Russian womanhood, already common in description of Russian actresses, took on a heightened quality of nationalism. In this context, tributes commemorating Savina as the ideal Russian woman positioned her as an emblem of widespread wartime visions of Russian culture. Portraying Savina in this manner undoubtedly served the agendas of many who longed for a sense of cultural unity during the war. However, Savina's death commanded public attention and was portrayed in these ways not simply because wartime commentators sought to bend all coverage in a patriotic and nationalistic direction. It did so because Savina herself was a master of self-creation and recreation who stood at the center of a network of publicity and civic organizing that gave her enormous influence. Savina's transformation into a symbol of respectable Russian womanhood and patriotic culture was much more than an act of discursive appropriation by critics and journalists. It was a culmination of the actress's lifelong cultivation of her public image. Savina's career was a case study in the use of the press to gain power and influence in late imperial Russia. She was known for her ability to obtain favorable press coverage by cultivating relationships with influential journalists and publishers, which she in turn used to enhance her power within the imperial theater bureaucracy. She did so in collaboration with Molchanov, who served as the chairman of the Russian Theatrical Society, the leading professional association for actors which Savina had helped to create. The son of a wealthy textile merchant, Molchanov was a former government official and a director for the Russian Society for Shipping and Trade, and had many contacts in the upper echelons of society. Savina's marriage to him, her third, was a strategic alliance that allowed her to draw upon his connections in the worlds of commerce, government, and the arts to enhance her own standing. Together they formed what the former director of Imperial Theaters, Sergei Volkansky, termed, quote, the Savina-Molchanov coalition, to control the workings of the Alexandrinsky theater. This frequently involved using the press to the actress's advantage. Notably, from 1906 to 1909, Molchanov and Savina collaborated together on a publication that marshaled newspaper coverage into an impressive statement of Savina's status. This was the volume Russkie Sadistiske Iskustvo za Granice, a nearly 900-page tribute to the 10th anniversary of Savina's 1899 tour of Berlin and Prague. Molchanov served as editor and combined lengthy excerpts from Savina's diary with hundreds of pages of press coverage related to the tour in the foreign and domestic press, which he described as historical documents presented without alteration, quote, in the interests of objectivity. While a few tepid and unflattering reviews were indeed featured to bolster this claim to objectivity, the collection positioned Savina as a historically significant figure who represented the achievements of Russian culture. For her own part, Savina wrote in the volume of her desire to promote Russian art and, quote, our beautiful language, the language of Pushkin and Turgenev, abroad. In both content and form, this 1909 volume provided a clear template for the death of Maria Savina. The actress's attempt to set herself up as a respectable emblem of and ambassador for Russian culture, and her role in the volume's creation, demonstrates that the posthumous publication overseen by Molchanov was a clear continuation of the actress's own strategies of image management. In preparing the death of Maria Savina, Molchanov drew upon this earlier experience and his network of professional contacts to create another tribute based on press materials. The result was an elaborate 2-volume work that examined her death and commemoration in exhaustive detail. Work on the project began almost immediately after Savina's funeral. To complete this complex task, Molchanov enlisted the help of Ilya Osipov, publisher of the Petrograd daily entertainment magazine Obozorenie Teatrov, and later the writer and theater critic Nikolai Dolgov. The first volume featured detailed descriptions of Savina's death and funeral in Petrograd, a compendium of commemorative activities held in her honor in more than 40 cities throughout the empire, a list of wreaths and inscriptions brought during requiems in the funeral, and the text of hundreds of telegrams of condolence sent to the RTO and Molchanov. In most cases, these details were drawn from the press, which Dolgov crafted into a hagiographic narrative highlighting Savina's talent, dignity, and refinement. The first volume was full of religious overtones that expanded on press portrayals of Savina as a pious Orthodox woman. The title page prominently featured an Orthodox cross surrounded by a funereal wreath. The volume began with an epigraph in Church Slavonic from the Gospel of John. Funeral services for Savina were described in great detail, with the words spoken by priests reproduced in full and liturgical language appearing in bold Church Slavonic text. 2 full-page photographs of Savina's bedroom appeared as well, both prominently showing a large personal iconostasis containing more than a dozen icons. These pious features reinforced Savina's place in the rhetoric of sacred union and continued her larger efforts to counteract her reputation as the thrice-married, domineering dictator of the Alexandrinsky with a model of pious, respectable femininity. Careful presentation of the depth and breadth of press coverage took pride of place in the second volume, which was presented as an objective reference work on a major figure. A large photograph of Savina at the beginning of this volume conveyed the themes the collected material was meant to suggest. The photograph was a dignified portrait of the actress wearing a cross and a half-dozen medals, including one bearing the image of Nicholas II, and another given as a special badge of distinction to select artists of the imperial theaters. The portrait was a visual statement of Savina's commitment to church, tsar, and art, and perfectly encapsulated the image of patriotic womanhood trumpeted in much of the press coverage on the pages that followed. The rest of the volume featured press materials about Savina published during the first 6 months after her death, arranged alphabetically by publication name and then chronologically for each title. The resulting tome boasted articles on Savina from 170 different periodicals from the Russian language press in 66 cities from every part of the empire, plus Harbin. The volume was meant to appear as a work of objectivity and scholarship. Careful bibliographic details were recorded for all published materials, and each entry came with complete reference information. Articles copied and reprinted in other publications were also noted, as were all cases in which material was omitted for redundancy, such as standardized biographies that appeared in many obituaries. Appendices listing all publications, both alphabetically and by city of publication, appeared, alongside indexes of all authors and named individuals mentioned in the press coverage. In these ways, the tome was both a statement of cultural respectability and a monument to the values of scholarly and scientific objectivity idealized in educated Russian society. Furthermore, the 2 volumes are striking examples of the use of the press to perpetuate a public persona in late imperial Russia and afford a rare glimpse into the mechanisms of public self-fashioning that were crucial to the maintenance of celebrity which Savina had mastered in her lifetime. As with the earlier 1909 volume, Molchanov was determined to use an impressive amount of press coverage to demonstrate Savina's significance and the resonance of her death. Within a few weeks of her passing, he had sent solicitations to editors of publications throughout Russia, asking for, quote, everything related to the late Maria Gavrilovna, and, quote, published from the day after her death forward to be sent to him at his expense. Others were enlisted in this research effort as well. Nikolai Dolgov searched for newspaper coverage on Savina's death in the provincial press at the public library in Petrograd. Furthermore, Molchanov used his business connections to secure the assistance of the local offices of the Society for Shipping and Trade in tracking down published materials about Savina. The company primarily operated in the Black Sea and Caucasus regions with local offices in many port cities. Molchanov sent offices in 11 cities requests for copies of all local press coverage of Savina's death from September 8th through November 1st of 1915, 10 of which were able to successfully track down and return materials to him. Additionally, Molchanov also hired the services of the Bureau of Newspaper Clippings, a Petrograd business that collected press coverage on behalf of clients. The Bureau, founded in 1901, monitored between 150 to 200 publications in the periodical press and was a clear marker of the growing importance of publicity in the press to Russian life. In this case, the company gathered 420 clippings from the Russian language press published between September 12th and September 30th for Molchanov. As a result of these multifaceted efforts, materials flowed into Molchanov from a wide range of Russian language publications from virtually every corner of the empire. This collection of news clippings was a physical manifestation of the networks of information tying together the empire's press, and the impressive amount of coverage produced in response to Savina's death demonstrated the actress's prominent place within this textual public sphere. The publication of the memorial volumes was a clear attempt to showcase Savina's place in educated society and Russian cultural life. In doing so, Molchanov and others drew upon practices of commemoration common in civil society. Commemorative volumes in honor of notable people were fixtures in Russia in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. As was the case in much of Europe and North America at this time, remembering someone's life often involved careful attention to their death, frequently in the form of memorial cards and photographs of the deceased. Publications in memory of public figures were common in late Imperial Russia, and elaborate descriptions of their deaths and funerals frequently featured in them and served to demonstrate their larger public significance. Public calls to create such volumes in the aftermath of a prominent death were common and often capitalized on public interest in the deaths of famous figures. Volumes of this nature, indeed, were not only reserved for figures of national prominence, but were also produced by civic organizations for their members or for figures of more modest renown. These published acts of memory were consequently compendiums of Russian civil society's commemorative practices as they brought together speeches, press materials, and essays to preserve and elevate the posthumous status of notable individuals. While the death of Maria Savina clearly reflected this larger culture of commemoration, this particular publication stood out in several respects. First, while detailed treatments of deaths and funerals featured prominently in other memorial publications of the era, Savina's death, funeral, and obituaries were the sole focus of the two volumes. Other volumes typically contained biographies or laudatory assessments of the contributions of the individual being commemorated, with the large public response to their death included at the end as a capstone meant to underscore the significance of the individual's life. In Savina's case, however, death took center stage, as the work's title made abundantly clear. The volumes cumulatively asserted that Savina's death was not simply an occasion to reflect on her life, it was itself a worthy subject of exhaustive treatments. While clearly meant to establish Savina's place in the cultural pantheon, the pervasive tone of loss and grief in the work's content conveyed an appropriately subdued tone for an empire at war. Against the backdrop of mass death, the death of Maria Savina represented a growing fixation on death itself that came to be reflected in other commemorative publications that would emerge in Russia's era of war, revolution, and civil war in the coming years. Additionally, the size and the cost of the two volumes distinguished them from other commemorative publications and revealed that it was intended for an elite audience of the kind with which Savina sought to be associated. The scale of the volumes and their level of detail called to mind official albums created for the imperial family more than it did other memorial collections of the day. A full-page announcement meant for publication in journals to solicit advance orders for the volumes noted that a limited run of just 300 copies of each would be printed. Furthermore, the two volumes would be sold for the considerable price of 35 rubles, 42 rubles with the hard binding, for subscribers who made a down payment of 10 rubles and at a promised higher rate when on general sale, with all the proceeds being set aside to fund philanthropic works in Savina's name. This was considerably more expensive than typical commemorative publications, and even the 1909 tome, which had sold for a still pricey 5 rubles. Even accounting for significant wartime-related inflation by 1916, the volumes were conspicuously priced as luxury goods and were meant to readily distinguish them from the kind of booklets and albums about famous figures advertised in the entertainment press and often sold for a few rubles or even kopecks. Indeed, in the year that the first volume was supposed to appear, a compendium of deaths of famous actors that was published by the journal Teatr и Искусство sold for just 5 rubles. So this was something that was 7 times higher than what was already a volume that contained quite a bit of detail, just for comparison there. The sense of exclusivity was even more apparent from the list of 66 prominent individuals to be sent complimentary copies by Molchanov. At the top of the list stood Emperor Nicholas II and Empress Alexandra, followed by Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna and Grand Duke Sergei Mikhailovich. The priests who officiated Savina's funeral also included, along with important figures in the Russian Theatrical Society and the bureaucracy of the imperial theaters, leading actors and directors, and notable critics and journalists. This list, which you can see part of on the right of the screen, reads as a compact statement of Savina's interlocking worlds of stage, state, press, civil society, and church, and provides a clear statement of the volume's intended audience. Celebrity status, death, and media coverage in the death of Maria Savina combined to create a portrait of the actress as an icon of Russian womanhood who represented the culture and institutions of the empire at a time when many representatives of the middle classes that had been Savina's core audience longed for a sense of national unity in the face of an increasingly disruptive and traumatic war. The history of this volume's creation reveals the networks of information, influence, and civil society that allowed Molchanov to continue Savina's efforts to shape her reputation and achieve cultural respectability. In bringing together disparate materials from across Russia, the volume created a cohesive narrative of Savina's contributions as an artist and her status as the embodiment of the ideal respectable woman for an empire at war. In capitalizing on Savina's lifelong cultivation of allies in the press and the wartime desires of many to find icons of Russian cultural unity, the death of Maria Savina reflected and aimed to shape a transformation of the actress's reputation in the wake of her death. Additionally, in treating the press as a historical source that implicitly conveyed stature through volume of coverage, the memorial tomes demonstrated the importance of the textual public sphere to legitimize claims to cultural and social status in late imperial Russia. By expanding upon the discursive frame of pious patriotic femininity that was already present in the press, the death of Maria Savina sought to reimagine existing commemorative forms and public rhetoric to demonstrate the significance of a celebrity actress to Russia in 1915. The desire for stature and attention that characterized Savina's career was recast in the language of respectability and restraint, transforming a public spectacle and media sensation into something appropriate for an empire gripped by total war. Like the grand visions of middle-class society and regime loyalists longing for a unified natural culture to emerge from the war, the vision of respectability projected by the two volumes collided with the rapid changes of revolution. Originally intended to be completed by the fall of 1916, production delays prompted by wartime material shortages and rising costs caused the first volume to only appear in January of 1917. By the time the second volume was printed in early 1918, revolution had already swept away the world in which Savina's memory was meant to be secured, and its creators quickly sought to distance themselves from the volume's strong religious tones and general representation of values that had suddenly shifted from respectable to reactionary in the context of revolution. Nevertheless, this curious publication is a significant source for revealing the ways in which public death and the mass circulation press could be mobilized to create new narratives for public figures, and stands as a testament to the dynamics of the late imperial textual sphere and the dynamic role that celebrity performing women played in it in both life and in death. All right, thank you.